Hi folks, welcome to another Strategic Thinking Concepts session. We have a wonderful practitioner here with us today who's going to be discussing strategic leadership. And before I get into that, just to set the stage a little bit, you recall in crafting and implementing strategy, the first part, the strategic management portion of it, is very much a science that we look at models and fill in the data, apply some of that, draw some so what's out of it. And then that's the first part of what managers do. But then we morph, we transform, we shift from strategic management over to strategic leadership, where we move from this science more into an art on implementation. And that's what I want to talk a bit about today, some of the insights that our guest has for us on strategic leadership based on a wonderful paper that she's produced. So our guest today is Carolyn Phillips-Cusson. She's a managing consultant, an entrepreneur, accomplished in multi-industry backgrounds to include retail, government, banks, is been involved with wealth management. I go on and on with a list of things she's accomplished. She was once dubbed the artist in a business suit. She's always called upon to serve her community and charitable and gives freely of her time. And if we have time today, we'll touch upon one or two of her pet projects recently. Her company, CUE, Charlie Uniform Echo Consulting, she specializes in developing organizations, social enterprises, cultural events, coaching leaders in performance and growth through change. Carolyn, you've recently written and done some excellent work on a research paper discussing not-for-profit festival leaders using two leadership frameworks at a very high level. One was strategic leadership of Glenn Rowe, and the other I'm not familiar with is emotional intelligence, Daniel Goldman. In fact, you've been generous enough to say to our folks watching today that in the bonus section, a copy of your report will be in there for our folks to look at. That's so generous. Thank you for that.
Welcome.
So my first question then might be, for a few minutes, can you explain a little bit about these leadership concepts and characteristics?
Certainly. First of all, Terry, the topic was leadership characteristics that are associated with the success and sustainability of cultural and festivals, cultural and music festivals, that is. And the first that you mentioned, Professor Rowe's strategic leadership framework. He, by the way, is from the University of Western Ontario with the Ivy School. It's a made in Canada scale of strategic leadership.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah. And I chose each of these between this and Daniel Goldman's, well known for his work on emotional intelligence in the educational and also business field. He's hard not to run across these days, even popular science type magazines, primarily because they were behavioral based scales. And when I say behavioral, I mean leader behavior rather than best practices and that sort of thing. Should I tell you a little bit more about the models?
I think that'd be helpful.
Would be helpful. Rowe's strategic leadership model has, as I say, a defined list of actual behaviors for three basic styles. And we're quite intuitive. The first is a visionary style, the second is managerial, and the third is a strategic style leader.
Okay.
And he essentially says that a strategic style leader is the only one that is able to affect short-term success and long-term sustainability in organizations.
Say that again slowly.
He says that particular style, the strategic leadership style, is the only style, really, that over time will affect sustainability in organizations.
That's interesting.
And he also says that only 5 to 10% of the general population of leaders has a strategic leadership style. He may have altered that since his last couple of papers, but he says that they're a rare breed. And
But does his book give the some of the attributes, some of the characteristics of a strategic leader?
You know, I'm not sure if the book is out. I'm going to contact Professor Rowe. He was very generous with his time to help me come up with this tool that I used for my research. It's a very, he has a couple of articles that are very easy to understand. The visionary, by the way, in managerial, that sort of goes without speaking, you know, saying anybody that understands visionary and managerial style leaders. But the strategic leader is the one in his mind that combines the very best of visionary traits as well as managerial, but to a higher level, because a strategic leader embodies the value system and the ethical standards and a number of other judgment-based traits.
I think we've covered some of that in the sense that certainly our MBA programs, we've talked in terms of most MBA courses will teach you the data, the information, the knowledge that you need to be a good manager, a good administrator. And with that comes management administration on this side. But the transformation of that shift to move from data, information, knowledge to wisdom, the critical thinking aspect, that ability to move yourself forward, that 5% you're talking about, I sense would flow from that. I think, is that the right way to explain the concept?
That's very well put. So much strategic leadership literature out there. The second framework was Goldman's emotional intelligent leadership styles model. And I know Dr. Carolyn Phillips-Cusson teaches that as part of the program in the leadership program.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm a fan. I really, it struck a chord with me, particularly with cultural and music based organizations, that the 6 styles that he talks about are visionary, coaching, democratic, affiliative, pace-setting, and commanding. And he simply says that leadership behavior is most effective using the first 4 styles. Those would be the visionary, coaching, democratic, and affiliative. And he calls those resonance type styles, that you get better out of people when you use those resonance styles. And that visionary of all of them is the most important for leaders of organizations. And on the other hand, he says that the pace-setting and commanding styles are called the dissonant styles. Not surprisingly, and he said they should be used sparingly, and that also an emotionally intelligent leader actually uses a combination of 2 to 4 styles routinely.
I think some of my colleagues would say I've got a commanding style.
You think?
Yeah, probably not a good thing. But the visionary style, I understand. We talked today in one of the videos we made about GE and the lack of vision and what's happened to that wonderful blue chip stock, because they haven't had the vision to look out in front of what's coming at them in this new industrial age of the Internet of Everything.
Yes.
And they've just missed the mark, and as a result, this thing is balkanizing, and it was once the poster child for business in the States.
So many examples of that. I know I was an investment advisor for many years, and the interesting part, of course, with these 2 frameworks is that they're behaviorally based, but they intersect, of course, because just what you've identified, that values-based and vision is also part of being a strategic leader.
Why don't you share with me the approach you took for this study, for this report?
Sure.
Share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I will. It's a really unusual, out-of-the-box MBA project. I'll give you that.
Love it.
And
let me just say, the rule we have around here is first break all the rules.
Yes. There you go. The rules are there are no rules, especially at RRU, by the way. So I started looking at business and general leadership literature and writings available, and there's no lack of that, of course. But then I started looking at events, festivals, and there's quite a bit about event management, of course, the how-tos on how to do things. A lot of articles on the socioeconomic trends of how events and particularly cultural tourism events are impacting communities and impacting.
You work closely with a large one down in the Maritimes, a very successful, started by Ian Fraser, Colonel Black Watch.
Yes.
The Nova Scotian tattoo has been a hallmark, almost a national treasure. Some lessons there, a chance to work with Ian?
Great idea. I hope so. Yeah, I'm a military brat too, so I come by it honestly.
Good.
But there were all these how-tos, and there were all these event things. Very little to nothing about, I would say, that's a leadership, and certainly leadership behaviors writing that would be relevant, or that certainly isn't specific to arts and culture, festival, and that sort of thing, organizations. So that's where there was a bit of a stretch. Of course, a lot of leadership writing is just very general and it doesn't get specific. And a lot of it, of course, is drawn on corporate America, corporate North America, and people like Glenn Rowe acknowledge that, and it's an interesting evolution as we get more in the space. I also looked at a number of writing articles, mostly news articles, on festival event failures, and they're hard to ignore. So many of them swimming in red ink, a backdrop of changing demographics. You mentioned the tattoo. I don't know the specifics of that, but I certainly know Nova Scotia, like the rest of the world, is changing demographics. And how long are these considered to be relevant in the eyes of their markets? And the long-standing festivals are losing.
I read a report the other day that 22% of Canada are visual minorities right now.
Yes.
And they wouldn't necessarily have the same cultural sensitivity to a Royal Highland Regiment and pipers and the Queen's colours and things.
True.
It wouldn't have the same meaning.
It's an ever-changing world, and so there's some of the challenges they face. And so I was curious what a successful leader, looking at all this, really looks like in the eyes of those running festivals, and especially those that had succeeded, and actually those that had experienced some failure. And the second part of that, Terry, from my approach was, how does this differ? How do nonprofits differ? How do the behaviors and leadership attributes and style? And when I say style, that's just a packet of behaviors based on those frameworks. So you asked why I decided this. I'd been running my own small festival, as you know, Celtfest Vancouver Island.
And successful from everything I hear.
Yes, thank you very much. But I quickly realized the challenges of doing festivals, certainly off the side of your desk. Primarily...
I've got to jump in again.
Okay, go ahead.
But it seems to me, and maybe you can just talk to me for a minute, my observation is, having worked with a number of volunteer organizations, I find wonderful volunteers. They step forward, and folks who have a little extra time give so freely their time. One of the recent ones I was involved with, Cabera, was women with HIV and children in that African, in Nigeria, and Cabera was the village.
Yes.
And we had to get materials and things to them to help them. And these were wonderful volunteers, but there were no business skills. And but they're all like those iron filings we talk about in a white sheet of paper, all pulling hard, going in different directions. But they needed that magnet, those business skills, to point them in one direction.
Absolutely.
Do you find the same thing?
For sure. I was just going to say, you took the words out of my mouth, how so many of these festival leaders have to do more with less. They have to pull a rabbit out of the bag every time. They're at the mercy of what volunteers they attract, or volunteers come and report. They have a lot to deal with. Plus, when you compound the fact that these volunteers and teams that are built in these structures for festivals, big festivals, there can be as many, I know, in France, the big piping festival, Lorient. I believe I last heard there were something like 2,500 volunteers. I could be even light on that. So you can imagine, when there's tens of thousands of people, your customers, your stakeholders, coming in, expecting to be entertained, paying good money, and then you have festival volunteers that are basically running the show.
Takes certain leadership.
Well, they're all there, and it's make or break in those first few days, those days that you're there. You don't have a whole year to get it right. You know, one of my head volunteers, a site manager, had said to me, you know, we just hit the ground running, and that's exactly what happens in these events.
Well, it's a passion, I guess, it shows out here, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The festivals are products of passion, so it kind of takes the leader, you know, the right leader to be able to manage that. But my intention, actually, Terry, to approach this was really tapping on the extraordinary leaders that I had seen at conferences that I bumped into that actually had these very big festivals. And to have a look at, you know, those aspects of leadership that I thought were, you know, pivotal to running successful operations, and not only that, sustainable and cultural operations. And so using my frame of reference, I actually chose 6 Canadian multi-day music festivals and or cultural festivals, and asked if they'd participate in my research. And I was really surprised at the enthusiasm, I just have to say.
They gave freely.
I was so surprised.
Isn't that amazing?
And so my intention actually was to interview the leader, and then 2 to 4 people that worked very closely with the leader around them. So they could be staff, they could be, you know, board members or volunteers. And then I was going to go and do a focus group in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, where I was at a conference with international festival leaders, and then get them to complete, and everybody that had participated in the research to date, to complete a questionnaire, just basically to consolidate the data. But what happened when I got to the festival, international festival focus group, I had said to them, feel free to just share with your colleagues. So what happened at the end of the
Floodgate open.
Be careful what you ask for, exactly. Over 70 organizations, not just 6. And we're always talking about scope creep in our, but over 70 organizations, we checked the IP addresses. It was all anonymous data, of course, but we were able to ascertain there were people from Denmark, people from Scotland, people from Germany, people from France, people from heavily in the U.S. That participated in our research. So that was kind of interesting how it can go that way, particularly since you just asked why I decided on this. I wasn't actually going to do anything to do with the music or the arts. I thought, with my financial acumen, do something more important or edifying. But this is so interesting how it's developed this way.
I think the knowledge you've acquired is going to be very valuable, all this benchmarking things, and I'm surprised that these organizations shared so willingly. But that data, information, knowledge you brought back, consolidated, is it a lot of it in the report?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely.
It's going to be a treasure trove.
Thank you.
A treasure trove.
Well, it's been asked for. People in the Maritimes, they've got me as a guest speaker for Nova Scotia Music Week next year. I've been asked actually to lecture on cultural sustainability here at Royal Roads as a guest speaker, and you never know where some things will take you when you're passionate about them.
Well, let's talk about some of these the key findings from your reports. Can you share at a very high level some of the key findings, something that our folks out here watching would aha, that's interesting.
Well, let me first of all say that, again, to review, breaking it down, I looked at what the leadership styles and attributes in festivals were. Then I also needed to look at what the leader's contribution is perceived to, how the leader's contribution is perceived to influence the outcome. I didn't want to be presumptuous that, the leader is, the key success factor. So that was the second part of it. And the third part was the degree to which the prevailing leadership styles align with what's considered optimal strategic leadership and emotionally intelligent leadership using those scales. So that was the third part. So the findings were really interesting. With Rowe's framework, pretty well spot on aligned. Interesting. I coded the data of the leaders using his framework, and 90% of the organizations said that the strategic leadership style was optimal in effect, once you code all the behaviors and analyze it. And further, that these organizations associated strategic leader behaviors with sustainability of their festivals. So, and that's what's other interesting fact is that strategic leadership style prevailed in over 50% of the respondents' festivals.
Does that fly in the face of any of the...
It does, actually. So is strategic leadership rare or not? There's a good question, because Professor Rowe says that strategic leadership is rare. Not in my study.
No, you said 5%, I think you said.
Well, 5 to 10, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and authors have picked up on that, I've seen, and said, well, it might be a little more than 10. But
and you found?
What does that tell us?
What percentage did you find, roughly?
Well, that in all the studies, 50%. In the Canadian focus, like the actual group the subject festival group from Canada, they were actually slightly more.
Have you shared that back or tested it? It's a good thing to challenge and test hypothesis. So.
Well, another project. That'll be my next step, I suppose.
Good.
So this is also interesting too, is splitting the summary response data into 2 groups. And this is what's the valuable thing about doing surveys. Those who said their leaders had better short-term and long-term performance. So that was one group. And then the other group was those who indicate their performance was lower. So I had Group A, Group B, the top 50%, lower 50%. The higher performing group of festivals were more frequently headed by strategic leader style, by far.
Let me just go for a second on this. Is this just applicable to your particular group?
Self-selected group?
Yeah, or could I use that same information? Do you think it's migratable to other small volunteer organizations? Were the findings, do your gut tell you these probably the same? Or is it unique to what you're looking at?
I think, you know,
festivals?
I mean, just think of the self-selectedness of this study. You know, if you think of the fact that all these people want to participate, that means, first of all, they're eager to do a good job. They're also, the other part of this is that I did an average length of festivals were in operation of all the 70 or so festivals. They were more than 10 years old on average.
And that's better than most small business.
Right.
2, 3 years and you're gone.
That's right.
Yeah.
So when you think that they've managed to weather the storms and stay in operation, it could be a self-selecting group. But this is really interesting that, you know, if Professor Rowe says that in the general population it's a rare breed, I would submit that within the festival and arts sector, you have to be a strategic leader really to stay in business.
So you're saying you got a consolidation, a group rare breed is attracted to this particular festival.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that was one finding. Another finding that relative to vision you spoke of earlier, I identified 2 types of vision. And so it kept coming up over and over that not only were we talking with this group as visionaries that you know, are necessary to align their workers or their teams to their goals. But the other side that was really often described, and not surprisingly, was the creative and artistic side, and how those leaders had to possess that. One focus group individual from a big festival in the States said it all. I think he said, without magic, there is no event. So he equates
That's a nice turn of phrase.
vision.
Without magic, there's no event.
No event. And you know, I think Walt Disney may have said that.
Yeah,
That was
I love it. I love it.
one of the books, actually. I was interested on his book on creating magic. But so there's a disclaimer there, though. If these guys were visionaries, and a lot of them were, because they had a heated argument, they sort of said, oh, you know, strategic leaders, anybody can be an operational person. It takes the visionary. Their sidekicks were actually the other side. So Professor Rowe talks about how it's optimal to have one person who can embody the best of, you know, manager and visionary to become a strategic leader. But for those leaders that did very well as visionaries, they clearly had somebody at their side, being the operations person.
There's so much in there to talk about. I mean, what I'm hearing here is left brain and right brain. And what I'm hearing, you have the right brain, the big scope, the artistic flair for the vision. But you need the left brain, that left, right, the accounting side of the house to dot the I's, cross the T's, and make it happen, is what you're telling me.
So I think so.
And sometimes that can be incorporated in one person.
Yes,
But
optimally.
you're telling me you found it was valuable to have a good fit, a marriage between 2 that both bring different competencies to the table, but collectively the synergy is better.
Yeah, no, I would think so. Yes and no. When you talk about the synergy being better, one of the downsides that they talked about in the focus group, and I noticed in some of the research, Dr. Jacqueline Thayer-Scott, who's the former president of Cape Breton University, wrote on this quite extensively because she was also the president of Celtic Colours Festival for several years. There's also that tension that can exist when you have 2 leaders, one the visionary, one the managerial. And there have been a lot of notable downsides in the corporate world. You know, Professor Rowe talks about, you know, Schultz.
I think Steve Jobs, first time out with Apple, got fired from his own company because the vision was all there, but the implementation was driving him crazy.
Yep. Well, that was the downside of over-visionary leadership.
Yeah.
And that is actually something that was identified in this project. People actually had said that over-visionary leadership had run them into the ground, or that events had failed without that strategic side. But here's an interesting thing. Evolution of behavior. Of 2 of the long-standing festivals that I had in my subject group, 3 out of the 6. I have to look back at my research. 3 out of the 6 festival leaders reported switching behavioral styles.
Oh, did they?
Yep. There was a point at which they changed themselves from purely visionary style leaders to strategic leaders.
Now that's, I mean, we say that if you don't like change, you like irrelevance even more, and obviously they recognize many can't do that transformational shift, make the accommodation, and they hit the wall. I mean, we see it in small business every day that the visionary, the entrepreneur comes up with the idea, but is unable to let go of the wheel and get into the other world, and so the thing just crashes.
Yep. Yep. Well, that indicated a willingness to adapt, to change. It also steered their festivals in the right way. It also made them more popular leaders. It also built their relationships to be much more strong amongst their group. And they, by the way, credited the frankness of their co-workers. And that was a testimony actually to forge strong relationships on the part of the leaders. So their co-workers apparently had pointed a lot of things out to
And
these
that
leaders.
jumps for innovation, doesn't it? It was Gary Hamel wrote the book Leading the Revolution, and the 5 characteristics for making the ground fertile for innovation to take place. And one of the things he talked about was new voices. And what I'm hearing here is that the best leaders are the ones that are prepared to listen to the new voices, to not just, you can have your say and not do, but actually listen, and where there's merit, implement it and do it. That does pretty good bonding. Well, using Coleman's emotional intelligence framework, were there any noticeable exceptions? Can you share those thoughts with us?
Oh, for sure. First of all, the EI, emotional intelligence competencies, were highly credited for festival success and sustainability. I mean, especially personal and social competencies, not surprisingly, and relationship management.
Very important.
Relationship management competency, which is part of Goldman's framework, includes developing others, communications, and teamwork. However, there were some misaligned findings, and they happened on 2 fronts. The first was coaching style. Coaching style was very rare in the subject festivals.
That's strange.
Yeah, you'd think, especially since empathy is considered a key characteristic for a successful leader, and that's an underlying competency in Goldman's framework for coaching style. So it's interesting, while they were considered empathetic, they actually didn't display the behaviors of coaching. The only exceptions, Terry, really were 2 of the festivals contemplating succession. And that's where they started to mentor new people into their positions. But
some of the best leaders are the ones that have a succession plan.
Exactly, and that's really why they were coaching. But why would a style that builds on developing others within the relationship, management competency framework, why would they not coach? So that was a disconnect. I sort of flagged that, by the way, as being perhaps something to do with the industry, or probably the stage of the festivals, or whatever. And the other thing had to do with, remember I said that Goldman said that you should use the dissonant styles, pace setting and commanding sparingly? Well, that isn't the case for a lot of the leaders in the festival world. I was surprised to note, and you can see on my paper, it's all charted out, that when they were evaluated by their peers and also evaluating themselves in the focus group, they saw themselves as using those styles fairly frequently.
That's interesting. I mean, the anomalies that you pointed out, this is going to be a fascinating paper for, I say, it's so kind of you to put it up on the site for those that take the time interested in strategic leadership. It's going to make a valuable read. How many pages is it?
Well, if you don't count the appendix and
Yeah,
whatnot,
we
it's
never count
probably
appendix.
about 85
Oh,
or
good.
down.
Fascinating
Might
read.
be 100, I'm sorry.
Friday night read. What else did you find exceptional or unique about leadership for not-for-profit organizations?
Well, this is interesting. Unique success factors. Leadership, I remember I said I didn't want to assume that leadership was the be-all and end-all for the success and sustainability of these organizations. And because they have different metrics, it was quite interesting to see how they evaluated success. And this is exactly the order that they set on the, for frequency and importance for measuring their success. First of all was the positive feedback by their volunteers and staff. That was one. Positive feedback by their community, specifically their local community where they live, and positive feedback by their artists, which would be considered their contractors. That was even before ticket sales. So interesting.
But I'm thinking of we do here at Royal Road some sort of a once a year review, community involvement review. These are sort of the same questions, aren't they?
Interesting. Well, are they?
They should be.
They should be.
They should be.
That's the other thing is these are innovative metrics, I suppose, that you read about in literature that nonprofits have to always come up with.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you justify your existence, especially if you lose money? But it's definitely a people-first focus.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Lessons learned from the paper for MBAs. We're getting close to our finish time now, but for MBAs watching today, are there any sort of lessons emerging out of this that we can, again, it's a couple of aha moments, anything percolating? Are there some things? You're smiling, good.
Yeah, I just, for MBAs out there, I would really encourage you to look at something you're passionate about. If you're going to spend a year of your life researching and writing, don't necessarily go for what you know. I wasn't going to do this, as I said, but Deirdre Campbell, who is one of our...
But you've grown because of it.
MBA. I have, and it's a fascinating area.
And you've opened up, by the sound of it, an interesting little niche that hasn't been filled before, that you're going to become the resident expert. If you're being called across Canada to give these sort of talks and chats and share, obviously some value in what you've done.
I'll never say never. But I guess the point is that if it's a value to you, it's probably a value to others somewhere in the world. For festival leaders and governors, in the paper I've outlined a number of action steps and recommendations. They include hiring and developing leaders with the right combination of strategic leader and emotional intelligence competencies and skills. Try to affect that balance of visionary and managerial abilities, as well as, very key, the strong relationship building skills. I know it's asking for a perfect person, really, when you think about that.
We have a saying, God's not finished with you yet.
Exactly.
There's still time to get there.
Well, that leads me to my next point, is this nature versus nurture. You're reading my mind today, Terry. Really, what's responsible for the fact someone has visionary skills, for instance, that are really important, especially in the artistic sense. I saw you were doodling over there. You have that in you have an artist brain as well. Can you teach vision? I mean, most of the respondents, especially in the focus group and the individual interviews, said no.
I'm going to
Can
disagree.
you teach vision?
You
disagree?
I think I disagree in the sense that we all have a left and a right brain. The problem is we allow the right brain to atrophy. We don't use it. We're so trained in our school system to memorize the 10 points on page 69 that we don't dream. Wouldn't it be nice if? And so the muscle we all have, we just have to exercise it and get it built back up again. But I think we all have that ability to some degree or another to, with the right brain thinking, to leap tall buildings and dream the dream. We just have to put the seeds, make it fertile.
And then adding to that is these leaders in the study that actually switched their behaviors over wholesale.
They were able to do that.
How did they do that? So that is actually by definition part of what a strategic leader is being able to be adaptive. And one of the big things that came out of this was the importance of creating a learning organization. So you yourself
that's everything.
Must be a learner and
lifelong.
And then you contribute and develop your organization that way. Yes.
Lifelong. Well, Carolyn, I'm going to close it there as the interest of time. Unless there's any last little points you wanted to make.
Sure. I would say that leaders of both sectors, nonprofit and for-profit, have a lot to learn from each other. I think in this world right now we're seeing increased corporate responsibility, social responsibility, more of the 3 E's going on for the environmental awareness and economic as well, the balanced scorecard and social. Even the UN right now has a cultural pillar now they're adding to social because they feel that's important.
I saw that the other day. That's another whole topic we could discuss.
Another time. But I guess my whole point is that the stuff that nonprofit leaders are made of, they rival, I think, those attributes and characteristics of a C-suite CEO.
Yeah.
And I feel that, those of us that have been lucky enough to have developed or certain, acumen and skill sets, in corporate situations, I think it's incumbent on us to contribute more, volunteer out there and share your skills. But the other thing, I do think that there's a lot of success in the festival world, and I would really call upon them to share as well and have a lot more cross-sector activity. I know it's starting to happen with social enterprise, and it's a very exciting world out there.
Well, Carolyn, would you be willing to share a phone number?
Sure.
Or an email address might be better.
Yes.
To our audience, both MBAs, but externally, that just want to pick your brains, because I think some interesting things here.
Thank you.
That I'm sure there's questions out there that want to get at you for a few minutes and just see what you have to say, notwithstanding reading this particular wonderful reports you've done. Well, our guest today has been Carolyn Phillips-Cusson. It's been a marvelous chance to talk to a seasoned executive and not-for-profit and sharing some thoughts with us today on strategic leadership. It's been wonderful. I encourage you to have a look at the book. See you again soon. Bye-bye.